An unexpected reunion at the dance changed everything forever. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the person who once broke your heart suddenly reappeared in your life decades later? Would you run away, or would you face the past that has haunted you for years? Listen to this emotional story of redemption and second chances that will make you question everything you thought you knew about forgiveness. This is David Mitchell's incredible journey that will touch your heart and perhaps change how you see your own past regrets. In the quiet town of Millfield, Connecticut, where maple trees lined the streets and everyone knew each other's business, 58-year-old David Mitchell stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His once jet-black hair had faded to a distinguished salt and pepper gray, and the lines around his eyes told stories of both laughter and sorrow. Tonight was the 40th high school reunion, an event he had been avoiding for decades. The last reunion he attended was the 10th, and after what happened there, he had sworn never to return. But his daughter Eliza had convinced him otherwise. "Dad, you can't hide from your past forever," she had said last week over their Sunday brunch. "Mom's been gone for 3 years now. Maybe it's time to reconnect with old friends." David adjusted his navy blue tie, the same one his late wife Catherine had given him on their 20th anniversary. The familiar ache of loss pressed against his chest. Catherine had been his rock, his salvation after the turbulent years of his youth. She had never known the full story of what happened before they met, and he had preferred to keep it that way. Some wounds were better left undisturbed. As he grabbed his car keys from the bowl by the front door, his phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "Proud of you, Dad. Have fun tonight. And remember, be open to whatever happens." David smiled at his daughter's eternal optimism, a trait she had inherited from her mother. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the cool September evening. The drive to Millfield High School was short, but felt like crossing an ocean of memories. He passed the old cinema where he had his first date, the park where he and his friends would spend summer afternoons playing baseball, and finally, the football field where he had once been a star quarterback with dreams bigger than the small town could contain. The school parking lot was already filling up when David arrived. He recognized some cars and even more familiar faces as former classmates made their way toward the gymnasium, which had been transformed for the occasion. Banners proclaiming, "Welcome Class of '85," hung from the entrance, and the sounds of '80s hits spilled out into the night. For a moment, David considered turning around and driving back home. He could tell Eliza he went, had a decent time, and left early. She would never know the difference. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a mixture of curiosity and an inexplicable feeling that tonight mattered more than he could understand. David Mitchell, is that you?" A friendly voice called out from behind him. He turned to see Thomas Reynolds, his former best friend and teammate, approaching with a wide grin. Time had been kind to Thomas, who still maintained his athletic build despite the slight paunch that came with middle age. "Tommy," David said, genuine pleasure warming his voice as they embraced in a quick, firm hug. "You haven't changed a bit," Thomas laughed. "Liar, but that's why we've always gotten along. How long has it been? Must be 30 years. "Something like that," David admitted, feeling a pang of guilt for letting their friendship fade away. After the incident at the 10th reunion, he had withdrawn from most of his high school connections, including Thomas. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. Come on in, there's an open bar, and believe me, you'll need it when you see how badly some of our classmates have aged." The gymnasium had been transformed with twinkling lights, round tables draped in white cloths, and a dance floor where several couples were already swaying to Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time. David followed Thomas to the bar, nodding and waving at familiar faces along the way. Some he recognized immediately, while others required a glance at name tags to connect present appearances with teenage memories. "Scotch neat," David told the bartender, needing something stronger than the champagne being passed around. "Make that 2, Thomas added, then turned to David. "So what have you been up to all these years? Last I heard, you were married with a daughter, working for that big architectural firm in New York." David took a sip of his drink, letting the warm liquid ease the tension in his shoulders. Catherine passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. He said it matter-of-factly, having learned that directness often spared him the awkward expressions of sympathy that he never quite knew how to handle. Thomas's smile faded. "I'm so sorry, Dave. I had no idea. It's okay. We had 25 good years together. And Eliza, our daughter, she's 24 now, working as a pediatric nurse in Boston. She's the one who convinced me to come tonight." "Smart girl," Thomas said, raising his glass. "To Catherine." "To Catherine," David echoed, touched by the gesture. As they caught up on 3 decades of life, marriages, careers, and children, David gradually relaxed. This wasn't so bad after all. The conversation flowed easily, and he found himself genuinely interested in hearing about his old classmates' lives. Thomas had become a high school football coach, married his college sweetheart Jennifer, and had 3 sons, all of whom had followed in his athletic footsteps. "And what about you?" Thomas asked. "Still designing buildings?" David nodded. "Chief architect at Marshall and Associates now. I was planning to retire next year, but honestly, I'm not sure what I'd do with myself. Work keeps me sane." "I get that. After Jenny and I lost our youngest, Sam, in that car accident 5 years ago, throwing myself into coaching was the only thing that kept me going." David's heart sank. "Tommy, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Thomas nodded, his eyes momentarily clouding with grief before he forced a smile. "Life goes on, right? That's what we tell ourselves." A comfortable silence fell between them, 2 men who understood loss in a way that words could never fully express. It was in that moment of quiet understanding that David felt a shift in the atmosphere around him, as if the air itself had suddenly become charged with electricity. He turned instinctively toward the entrance and felt the ground beneath him tilt. There she was, Rebecca Winters, the woman who had once been the center of his universe, whose absence had left a void he had spent decades trying to fill. She stood in the doorway, scanning the room with those same penetrating blue eyes that had once seen through every defense he'd ever built. Her blonde hair, once long and flowing, was now cut in an elegant bob that framed her face, highlighting cheekbones that had only grown more defined with age. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her still slender figure, a single strand of pearls around her neck. "Holy shit," Thomas whispered beside him, following his gaze. "Is that Becky Winters?" David couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare as the past and present collided with the force of a hurricane. "I heard she never came back to Millfield after college," Thomas continued, oblivious to David's internal turmoil. "Became some hotshot lawyer in California. Divorced twice, no kids. At least that's the gossip." Rebecca was greeting some former classmates now, her smile polite but reserved. She hadn't noticed David yet, and he found himself both dreading and longing for the moment their eyes would meet. "Dave, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." In many ways he had. Rebecca was the ghost of his greatest joy and his deepest regret. The woman he had loved with an intensity that had frightened him. The woman he had betrayed in a moment of weakness and confusion that had altered the course of both their lives. "I need some air," David muttered, setting down his glass and making his way toward the exit that led to the courtyard. He pushed through the double doors and gulped in the cool night air, trying to steady his racing heart. The courtyard was mercifully empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of string lights draped around the perimeter. David leaned against the brick wall, closing his eyes and traveling back to the last time he had seen Rebecca face to face. It was at their 10th reunion. He had been married to Catherine for barely a year, their relationship still new and fragile. He hadn't expected Rebecca to attend. She had been living in San Francisco then, building her career at a prestigious law firm. But she had appeared that night, just as unexpectedly as tonight, and everything he thought he had resolved within himself had come rushing back. They had talked, argued, cried, and in the end, they had parted ways with wounds still gaping, words of anger and hurt hanging in the air between them. David had driven home to Catherine that night, held her close, and made a decision to bury the past so deeply that it could never resurface to threaten the life they were building together. And now, 30 years later, that past had walked through the door in a black dress and pearls.
David?
The sound of his name in that voice, that achingly familiar voice, sent a jolt through him. He opened his eyes to find Rebecca standing a few feet away, uncertainty written across her features. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes and mouth, the slight softening of her jawline, the subtle signs of the years that had passed. But she was still Rebecca, still the girl who had once known him better than he knew himself. Rebecca, he managed, her name feeling both foreign and intimately familiar on his tongue. "I didn't expect to see you here," she gave a small, nervous laugh. "That makes two of us. I wasn't planning to come, but my therapist thought it might provide some closure." "Closure," David repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Is that what we need after all this time?" Rebecca moved closer, leaning against the wall beside him, her shoulder almost but not quite touching his. "I don't know what we need, David. I just know that I've spent too many years wondering, what if?" The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and shared history. From inside, the muffled sounds of Whitney Houston's "I Wanna Dance with Somebody" filtered through the closed doors. "I heard about Catherine," Rebecca said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." David was surprised by the lack of jealousy or resentment in her voice. The Rebecca he had known at 28 would have been incapable of such genuine sympathy for the woman who had become his wife. "How did you hear?" "Small-town gossip travels far. Linda Peterson. She's Linda Collins now. She's my cousin's neighbor in Sacramento. Word gets around." David nodded, remembering how information in Millfield had always spread like wildfire. "Some things never changed." "And you?" he asked. "Thomas mentioned you're a lawyer in California." "Was," Rebecca corrected. "I retired last year." "Environmental law. Spent 30 years fighting corporations that were polluting groundwater or destroying habitats. Not quite changing the world, but I'd like to think I made a small difference." "I'm sure you did more than that," David said, and meant it. Rebecca had always been passionate about causes, determined to fight for what she believed was right. It was one of the many things he had loved about her. She turned to face him fully then, her blue eyes searching his. "David, I didn't come out here to make small talk about our careers. I came because there are things I need to say to you. Things I should have said 30 years ago." David felt his chest tighten. "Rebecca, please let me finish. I've rehearsed this speech 1,000 times, and if I don't get it out now, I never will." She took a deep breath. "I was angry with you for so long. Furious, actually. What happened between us, the way things ended, it broke something in me. For years, I blamed you entirely. It was easier that way." David remained silent, knowing she needed to speak her truth. "But time has a way of bringing perspective. And therapy, lots of therapy," she added with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I came to realize that what happened wasn't just your fault. We were young, scared, faced with decisions no 22-year-old should have to make. And I pushed you away as much as you ran from me." The memories flooded back, the pregnancy test, the panic in Rebecca's eyes mirroring his own, the fight that followed when he suggested they weren't ready, her ultimatum, his retreat into silence, and finally, his betrayal with Jessica Palmer at a party when he was drunk and terrified of the future that was rushing toward him. By the time he had come to his senses, determined to make things right, Rebecca had terminated the pregnancy and left town, leaving only a note that said, "You made your choice. I've made mine." "I ran," David acknowledged, the admission both painful and liberating. "I ran because I was terrified of failing you, of failing our child. And instead of facing that fear, I destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to me. There hasn't been a day in 40 years that I haven't regretted it." Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We both made mistakes, David, terrible mistakes that we can't undo. But I didn't come here tonight to reopen old wounds. I came to finally let go of the anger I've carried for too long, to forgive you, and to ask for your forgiveness in return. David felt something shift inside him, a weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Of course I forgive you, Rebecca. There was never anything to forgive. And as for me, I forgave you a long time ago, she interrupted gently. I just needed to tell you in person. From inside, the music changed to a slow ballad, Bon Jovi's Always, and David found himself smiling at the irony of the song choice. Would you like to dance? He asked impulsively, holding out his hand. For old time's sake? Rebecca hesitated, then placed her hand in his. For old time's sake. They didn't return to the gymnasium, instead swaying gently in the courtyard beneath the string lights and stars. David held her at a respectful distance, yet there was an intimacy in their dance that transcended physical closeness. They moved together as if no time had passed, as if their bodies remembered the rhythm they had once shared. Do you remember the first time we danced? Rebecca asked, her voice soft with reminiscence. Senior prom, David replied immediately. You wore a blue dress that matched your eyes. I stepped on your toes 3 times and apologized so much you threatened to gag me with your corsage. Rebecca laughed, the sound warming something cold and dormant inside him. And then you kissed me under the disco ball, and I forgot all about my bruised toes. You tasted like the strawberry punch they were serving, David recalled, surprised by the clarity of the memory. I knew that night that I was in love with you. I knew long before that, Rebecca admitted. Sophomore year, when you defended Martin Weber from those seniors who were bullying him. You stood up to guys twice your size because it was the right thing to do. That's when I knew. They fell silent again, lost in memories of a time that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The song ended, but they continued to sway, neither willing to break the spell that had fallen over them. Finally, Rebecca stepped back, her hands lingering on his shoulders before falling away. I should go back inside. My friend Carolyn is probably wondering where I disappeared to. Carolyn Peters, David asked, remembering a quiet, bookish girl who had been part of Rebecca's circle of friends. Carolyn Michaels now. She lives in Boston, too. We reconnected a few years ago at a conference. She's the one who convinced me to come tonight, Rebecca smiled. Seems like we both needed a push from someone who cares about us. David nodded, thinking of Eliza. My daughter said it was time for me to stop hiding from my past. Smart kid. You have a daughter, Rebecca said, and there was a wistfulness in her voice that made David's heart ache. What's she like? Eliza is incredible, strong-willed, compassionate, brilliant. She's everything good in this world. He hesitated, then added gently, she would have been your daughter too, in another life. Rebecca's eyes clouded with emotion. In another life, she echoed. But this is the life we have, David, and I've made my peace with the paths we chose. She reached up and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, a gesture so tender and familiar that it nearly undid him. I'm staying at the Millfield Inn through the weekend. If you'd like to talk more, really talk about everything, I'd be open to that. I'd like that, David said, surprised by how much he meant it. Maybe coffee tomorrow? There's a new place on Main Street where the old bookstore used to be. Rosewater Books is gone, Rebecca asked, genuinely distressed. But Mr. Wilson promised he'd never sell. Mr. Wilson passed away 15 years ago. His son tried to keep it going, but David shrugged. Amazon happened, but the coffee shop that replaced it kept a small bookshelf in his honor. They even named a drink after him, the Wilson Special. Then we should definitely have the Wilson Special, Rebecca decided. 11 o'clock? 11 it is. She hesitated, then leaned in and kissed his cheek, her lips soft against his skin. Good night, David. It's good to see you again. Good night, Rebecca, he replied, watching as she made her way back to the gymnasium doors, her silhouette framed by the light from within. Just before entering, she turned and gave him a small wave, which he returned. Alone again in the courtyard, David touched his cheek where her lips had been. He felt simultaneously older than his 58 years, and as young as the boy who had fallen in love with Rebecca Winters 4 decades ago. The night air was cool against his skin, but inside a warmth had kindled, not the desperate, consuming fire of youth, but something steadier, more sustaining. When he finally returned to the reunion, the atmosphere had shifted from nostalgic reminiscing to the looser, more animated energy that came with alcohol and the shedding of initial awkwardness. Thomas was deep in conversation with their former science teacher, Mr. Callahan, who had aged into a jovial, white-haired gentleman still passionate about biology. David scanned the room and found Rebecca sitting with Carolyn and a few other women, laughing at something one of them had said. She glanced up, caught his eye, and smiled, a private, knowing smile that acknowledged what had passed between them in the courtyard. "There you are," Thomas exclaimed, noticing David's return. "I was about to send out a search party. You okay?" "Yeah," David said, surprised to find he meant it. "I'm good, actually. Better than I've been in a long time." Thomas followed his gaze to Rebecca, then looked back at David with raised eyebrows. "You want to talk about it?" "Not tonight," David replied. "But I'll take another scotch." As the evening progressed, David found himself drawn into conversations with former classmates, sharing stories of their high school days and catching up on the decades since. He danced with Linda Collins, who had been head cheerleader and was now a grandmother of 5, and with his former lab partner, Melissa Johnson, who had become a renowned physicist. He even shared a laugh with Jessica Palmer, now Jessica Thornton, the woman with whom he had betrayed Rebecca all those years ago. Time had smoothed those edges too, transforming youthful mistakes into distant memories without power to wound. Throughout it all, he was acutely aware of Rebecca's presence across the room. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and in those moments, David felt a connection that transcended the years and mistakes that had separated them. Not the rekindling of an old romance. They were different people now, shaped by different lives, but the possibility of something new. Forgiveness, perhaps, or understanding, or simply the acknowledgement that they had once meant everything to each other, and that meaning hadn't been erased by time and distance. As the reunion began to wind down around midnight, Thomas found David again. "A bunch of us are heading to Riley's pub for a nightcap. You in?" David shook his head. "I think I'm going to call it a night." "It's been a lot, I bet," Thomas said knowingly. "I saw you talking to Becky outside. You two work things out?" "No, we started to," David replied truthfully. "It's complicated. Life usually is," Thomas said, with the wisdom of a man who had known his share of joy and sorrow. "Listen, don't be a stranger, okay? Jenny would love to have you over for dinner sometime. And I mean it this time, not 30 years from now." David embraced his old friend. "I promise. And Tommy, thanks for being here tonight. It meant a lot." "That's what friends are for," Thomas said simply. As David made his way toward the exit, he passed by Rebecca's table. She was gathering her purse, preparing to leave as well. Their eyes met, and by unspoken agreement they moved to a quiet corner near the door. "Heading out?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm not much for after-parties these days," David admitted. "You?" "Carolyn and I are sharing a room at the inn. She's ready to call it a night too." Rebecca paused. "We're still on for tomorrow?" "Absolutely. 11 o'clock, Wilson's special." She smiled, and for a moment David could see the girl she had been, the first girl he had ever loved, the one who had taught him what love could be. "I'm looking forward to it." "Me too," he said, and was surprised by how true it was. They parted ways in the parking lot, David watching as Rebecca and Carolyn drove off in a rental car before getting into his own vehicle. The drive home was as short as the drive to the reunion had been, but everything felt different now. The town around him was the same streets, the same buildings, the same quiet rhythm of small-town life. But David himself had changed in the space of a few hours. As he unlocked his front door and stepped into the empty house that had once been filled with Catherine's laughter and Eliza's childhood exuberance, David felt not the usual pang of loneliness, but a curious sense of anticipation. He moved through the familiar rooms, turning on lights, hanging up his jacket, going through the motions of returning home after an evening out. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying his conversation with Rebecca in the courtyard, the feel of her in his arms as they danced, the brush of her lips against his cheek. In his bedroom, he loosened his tie and caught sight of the framed photograph on his dresser, Catherine on their wedding day, radiant in white, looking at him with love and trust. For the first time in 3 years, he could look at that photo without the crushing weight of grief. Catherine had been his salvation, his partner, the mother of his child. She had known about Rebecca, not the details, but enough to understand that David had loved deeply before her and had been hurt by that love. She had never been jealous of the ghost that sometimes stood between them, instead helping him heal from wounds he hadn't even known he still carried. "You would approve, wouldn't you?" he said aloud to the photograph. "You always said I needed to make peace with my past." He could almost hear Catherine's response, practical and loving as she had always been. "It's about time. David, just don't mess it up this time." With a smile, David got ready for bed, his mind already turning to tomorrow and the conversation that awaited him. There was so much to say, so many years to account for, so many regrets and joys to share. But for the first time in decades, he felt ready to face it all, the good and the bad, the choices made and the roads not taken. As he drifted off to sleep, David realized that tonight had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing. Not a second chance at a lost love, but a chance to finally heal a wound that had been festering for 40 years. And perhaps, in that healing, to discover who he could be without the burden of his greatest regret. Morning arrived with soft autumn sunlight filtering through the curtains. David woke earlier than usual, feeling a nervous energy that reminded him of his younger days. He showered, shaved with extra care, and spent more time than necessary choosing what to wear before settling on a casual blue button-down that Eliza had once said brought out the color of his eyes. Over breakfast, toast and coffee, his appetite diminished by anticipation, he debated calling Eliza to tell her about Rebecca. In the end, he decided to wait. There would be time for that conversation later, after he understood better what this reconnection meant. At 10:30, David left for Main Street, preferring to walk the short distance to the coffee shop rather than drive. The day was perfect, crisp but not cold, the trees just beginning to hint at the brilliant colors they would soon display. Millfield looked its best in autumn, the historic buildings and tree-lined streets taking on a postcard quality that made even long-time residents pause to appreciate their surroundings. The coffee shop, the daily grind, occupied what had indeed once been Rosewater Books. David had been inside a few times since its opening 5 years ago, usually grabbing coffee to go when he visited Millfield to check on his mother's house, which he had kept as a weekend retreat after her passing. The interior had been renovated with a modern industrial aesthetic, exposed brick, polished concrete floors, hanging Edison bulbs, but touches of the old bookstore remained, the original built-in. Shelves along one wall still held books, now a carefully curated collection available for purchase or borrowing while customers enjoyed their beverages. Mr. Wilson's antique desk served as the condiment station, and black and white photographs of the bookstore through the decades decorated the walls. David arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back, where a large window overlooked a small garden that had once been Mr. Wilson's pride and joy, now maintained by the coffee shop's owner as a tribute. He ordered 2 Wilson specials, hazelnut lattes with a hint of cinnamon, and waited, his heart beating a rapid rhythm against his ribs. At precisely 11 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed, and Rebecca entered. She was dressed more casually today in jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She spotted him immediately and made her way to the table, her smile warm, but tinged with the same nervousness he felt. "You're punctual as ever," David said, as she sat down across from him. "Some things never change." "And you still order for everyone before they arrive?" Rebecca replied, nodding at the 2 mugs on the table. "That hasn't changed either. I took a chance on the Wilson special." "I hope that's okay." Rebecca picked up her mug and took a sip, closing her eyes briefly in appreciation. Perfect. Mr. Wilson would approve. They fell into a momentary silence, both suddenly aware of the enormity of what they were attempting, to bridge 40 years of separate lives, to speak honestly about a past that had shaped them in profound ways. "So," David began, "where do we start?" Rebecca set down her mug and met his gaze directly. "How about the beginning? The last time we saw each other, really saw each other, was at the 10th reunion. You were married to Catherine for about a year by then?" David nodded, grateful for her directness. 11 months. We were still finding our footing as a couple, and I showed up unannounced, still carrying all that anger and hurt. Rebecca shook her head at the memory. "Not my finest moment." "You had every right to be angry," David acknowledged. "What I did was horrible," Rebecca finished for him. "Sleeping with Jessica while we were still together, while I was pregnant with your child. Yes, it was unforgivable at the time. But David, we've already established that I've forgiven you. That's not what I want to talk about today." "Then what do you want to talk about?" David asked, relieved and curious. Rebecca took another sip of her latte, gathering her thoughts. "I want to talk about what happened after. About the lives we built separately. About who we became without each other." She paused. "I want to know who David Mitchell is at 58. It was such a simple request, yet so profound. Not to dwell on the mistakes of the past, but to understand the people they had become as a result of those mistakes." David found himself smiling at her wisdom. "David Mitchell at 58, he began thoughtfully, is a man who loves his work but is thinking about retirement, who calls his daughter every Sunday without fail, who still plays pickup basketball with guys half his age and pays for it with sore knees for days afterward, who has learned to cook because eating alone is depressing enough without it also being takeout." He paused. "Who has been lonely since Catherine died, but who is finally starting to figure out who he is without her." Rebecca listened intently, her blue eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Thank you for that." "For being honest. Your turn," David prompted gently. Who is Rebecca Winters at 58? She laughed softly. Rebecca Winters, at 58, is a woman who retired from a career she loved because she finally admitted to herself that she was burning out, who has taken up painting badly but with great enthusiasm, who has a small house near the beach in San Diego with a garden that constantly threatens to overtake the property, who has been married twice to good men who ultimately couldn't compete with her work, who has no children of her own but is a devoted godmother to her best friend's twins. As she spoke, David could see the life she described, a life of purpose and accomplishment, of connections and solitude, of choices that had led her to this moment across the table from him. "Any regrets?" he asked, knowing it was a loaded question, but needing to ask it anyway. Rebecca considered this seriously. "Yes and no. I regret not trying harder in my marriages. I regret letting my career consume me to the point where there wasn't room for much else. I regret not reaching out to my parents before they died, thinking there would always be more time to heal those wounds." She met his eyes directly. "But I don't regret the choice I made 40 years ago. It was the right decision for me at that time, even though it was incredibly painful." David nodded, understanding she was referring to the terminated pregnancy. "I wasn't ready to be a father then," he admitted. "I handled it horribly, but that much was true. When Eliza was born 7 years later, I was a different man. Ready to embrace fatherhood, terrified but committed. We were so young," Rebecca said softly. 22, with our whole lives ahead of us. Neither of us was ready for what happened." "No," David agreed. "We weren't." They sipped their lattes in a silence that had grown comfortable, the weight of the past acknowledged, but no longer pressing down on them with such force. "Tell me about Catherine," Rebecca said eventually. "She must have been remarkable." David felt a surge of gratitude for this gesture, Rebecca's willingness to hear about the woman he had loved after her. "She was. Brilliant, funny, practical in a way that balanced my tendency to get lost in abstractions. She was a pediatrician, that's how we met, actually. I had a nasty case of strep throat, and my regular doctor was on vacation. She laughed when I hit on her while delirious with fever. Rebecca smiled. That sounds like you. She saw right through me from the beginning, David continued, memories washing over him with a bittersweet warmth. All my defenses, all my carefully constructed walls, she just waltzed right past them. After everything fell apart, I closed myself off, focused on my career, dated casually but never let anyone get close. Catherine changed that. She made me believe I could be loved again, flaws and all. I'm glad, Rebecca said sincerely. Everyone deserves that kind of love. Have you had it? David asked. With either of your husbands? Rebecca's expression turned wistful. With Michael, my first husband almost. We were good together for a long time. He was a professor of literature, brilliant and kind. But my career was taking off, just as he was settling into tenure, and eventually we were living parallel lives, rather than a shared one. With James, my second husband, that was more companionship than grand passion. A good man, but we married for the wrong reasons. I was 45 and thought it might be my last chance. He was 50 and tired of being alone. And now, David ventured, is there someone in your life? Not at the moment, Rebecca replied. I've been focusing on figuring out what retirement looks like for me. Dating hasn't been a priority. She gave him a curious look. What about you? Has there been anyone since Catherine? David shook his head. A few dates, all disasters. Eliza keeps trying to set me up with her boyfriend's mother, but I've resisted so far. It felt disloyal somehow. To Catherine's memory. But it's been 3 years, Rebecca observed gently. 3 years, 2 months and 16 days, David confirmed. Not that I'm counting. Rebecca reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She wouldn't want you to be alone. David, I didn't know Catherine, but from what you've told me, she sounds like the kind of woman who would kick your ass for using her as an excuse to avoid living. David laughed, surprised by the accuracy of this assessment. You're right. She actually made me promise, near the end, that I wouldn't become a recluse. Said she'd haunt me if I did. Smart woman, Rebecca said, squeezing his hand before withdrawing. As Rebecca withdrew her hand, David found himself missing the warmth of her touch immediately. The conversation had flowed so naturally, as if the decades apart had been mere days. There was a comfort in her presence that felt both new and achingly familiar. What are your plans now? David asked, finishing the last of his latte. After this weekend, I mean. Rebecca tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it transported David back. To their college days. Back to San Diego, I suppose. I've been volunteering with an environmental education program for kids, teaching them about ocean conservation. It's not saving the world through environmental law anymore, but seeing their faces light up when they understand why protecting our oceans matters. It's pretty rewarding. That sounds wonderful, David said sincerely. You always did have a way with explaining complex issues. I remember how you tutored me through environmental science when I was about to fail Professor Harrison's class. Rebecca laughed, the sound sending a pleasant warmth through him. You weren't going to fail. You just needed motivation to study. And what better motivation than spending extra time with the most beautiful girl on campus? David's comment slipped out before he could censor himself, and he immediately felt his face flush. Sorry, it was sweet, Rebecca interrupted, her own cheeks coloring slightly. And not unwelcome. Their eyes met across the table, and David felt a jolt of connection that transcended the years between them. It wasn't the desperate, consuming passion of youth, but something deeper, more grounded in reality and shared experience. Would you like to go for a walk? He suggested impulsively. The fall colors are just starting to come in at Riverside Park. It's not far from here. Rebecca checked her watch. I'm supposed to meet Carolyn for lunch at 1, but I have time for a short walk. They left the coffee shop together, walking side by side down Main Street. Millfield had changed over the years, but its essential character remained the same, a charming New England town that valued its history while cautiously embracing progress. Rebecca commented on the changes, The new businesses that had replaced familiar old ones, the historic buildings that had been preserved and repurposed. "Remember Thompson's Hardware?" she asked, pointing to what was now an artisanal cheese shop. "Mr. Thompson used to chase us away when we'd come in just to get warm in the winter. And then give us candy on the way out," David added, smiling at the memory. He was all bark, no bite. The walk to Riverside Park took them past Millfield High School, quiet on this Saturday morning except for a few students practicing on the football field. They paused at the wrought iron gates, looking in at the place where their story had begun. "Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been?" Rebecca asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the red brick building. "If we had made different choices?" David considered this carefully. "All the time," he admitted. "Especially after Catherine died. I found myself thinking about all the turning points in my life, all the moments when one decision changed everything that followed." "And do you regret it? The path you chose?" He turned to look at her, really look at her. This woman who had once been the center of his world, who had suffered because of his cowardice and immaturity. "I regret hurting you," he said honestly. "I regret not being brave enough to face my fears. But I can't regret the life I built with Catherine, or having Eliza, just as you can't regret the cases you won, the difference you made, the lives you lived." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Our choices made us who we are today, for better or worse." "For better, I think," David said, surprising himself with his certainty. "We've both lived meaningful lives, Rebecca. Different from what we imagined at 18, but meaningful nonetheless." They continued walking, crossing the street to enter Riverside Park, where the maple trees were just beginning to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. The Millfield River flowed peacefully alongside the walking path, its surface dappled with early fallen leaves. "This was always my favorite place in town," Rebecca commented as they strolled along the riverbank. "I used to come here to study, to think. To cry sometimes, after we broke up?" David asked softly. "Yes, and when my parents told me they wouldn't help pay for law school if I moved to California. And when I found out I was pregnant." She spoke matter-of-factly, without accusation. "This park has seen a lot of my tears. I'm sorry I caused so many of them," David said, his voice tight with emotion. Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him. "David, we can't change the past. I didn't bring all this up to make you feel guilty. We've both moved beyond that, I hope. I want us to be honest with each other now. No more running, no more hiding behind polite facades." David nodded, touched by her directness. "No more running," he agreed. "Which means I should tell you that seeing you again has affected me more than I expected. I can't pretend this is just a casual reunion between old friends." Rebecca's breath caught audibly. "What is it then?" "I don't know yet," David admitted, "but I'd like to find out. If you're willing." She searched his face, her blue eyes intent. "What exactly are you suggesting, David?" "I'm suggesting that maybe our story isn't over yet. That maybe there's a reason we both ended up at that reunion last night, after all these years. That maybe we deserve a chance to know each other again, as the people we've become." He took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that I'd like to see you again. Not just today, not just this weekend." Rebecca's expression was guarded, but he could see the flicker of possibility in her eyes. "I live in San Diego, David. You're here in Connecticut. That's not exactly conducive to whatever this might be." "I know," he acknowledged, "but I'm retiring next year. I've been thinking about selling the house. It's too big for just me, and everywhere I look, I see Catherine. I'm not tied to Millfield anymore, not really. Eliza is established in Boston. I could go anywhere." "Are you saying you'd move to California for me?" Rebecca asked incredulously. "Based on a coffee date and a walk in the park?" David laughed softly. "No, that would be crazy. I'm saying I'd like the chance to get to know you again, really know you. And if that means flying to San Diego occasionally, or you coming back east, then that's what we'll do. If it leads somewhere, well, I'm open to possibilities I wasn't ready to consider before yesterday." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds, the gentle rushing of the river and the distant shouts of children playing elsewhere in the park. Finally she spoke. "You know, For years after we broke up, I dreamed about this, about you coming back to me, telling me you'd made a terrible mistake. In my dreams, I always turned you away, held on to my anger and hurt like a shield." She smiled ruefully. "Reality is more complicated than those dreams. We're different people now. The David and Rebecca who fell in love at 18 don't exist anymore." "No, they don't," David agreed. "But maybe the David and Rebecca we are now could have something just as meaningful. Something built on who we've become, not who we were." Rebecca glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should get back. Carolyn will be waiting." David felt a pang of disappointment but nodded his understanding. "Of course." They turned and began walking back toward Main Street, a thoughtful silence between them. As they approached the point where they would need to part ways, Rebecca stopped. "I've spent 40 years trying to convince myself that I'm over you," she said quietly. "That what we had was just young love, intense but ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of my life. But seeing you again, talking with you, I realize that's not entirely true. You were my first love, David. You shaped me in ways I've never fully acknowledged." "Rebecca, let me finish," she said gently. "I'm not saying I've been pining for you all these years. I haven't. I've loved other men, built a life I'm proud of, found fulfillment in my work and relationships. But there's always been an unfinished quality to our story. I sense that it ended too abruptly, too painfully, with too much left unsaid." David nodded, understanding completely what she meant. "I felt the same way. So yes," Rebecca concluded with a small, tentative smile. "I'd like to see where this might lead. Slowly, carefully, with our eyes wide open. No romantic fantasies about recapturing what we once had, but maybe creating something new." Joy spread through David's chest, warming him from the inside. "I'd like that very much." They reached the corner where they needed to part ways, Rebecca to meet Carolyn for lunch, David to return home. There was an awkward moment where neither seemed sure how to say goodbye. "So," David began, "when do you head back?" "To San Diego?" "Monday morning," Rebecca replied. "My flight leaves from Hartford at 11. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? There's a new restaurant on the outskirts of town, the Twisted Vine. Farm to table, supposed to be excellent." Rebecca's smile was answer enough, but she nodded for good measure. "I'd love that." 7 o'clock? 7 is perfect. "I'll pick you up at the inn." Another moment of hesitation, and then Rebecca leaned forward and kissed his cheek, her lips lingering just a fraction longer than they had the night before. "Until tomorrow, David." "Until tomorrow," he echoed, watching as she turned and walked away, her cream-colored sweater bright against the backdrop of autumn trees. David stood there long after she had disappeared from view, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in his world. The familiar streets of Millfield seemed charged with new possibility, as if he were seeing them through new eyes, or perhaps through very old eyes made new again. When he finally turned toward home, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. He pulled out his phone and dialed Eliza's number, suddenly needing to hear his daughter's voice, to share this unexpected turn of events with the person who knew him best. "Dad?" Eliza answered on the third ring, sounding surprised. "Is everything okay? You never call on Saturdays." "Everything's fine," he assured her. "Better than fine, actually. I wanted to tell you about the reunion." "Oh!" Her voice brightened with interest. "How was it? Did you see your old friend Thomas? The one who was on the football team with you?" "I did," David confirmed, "but that's not why I'm calling. Eliza, I saw Rebecca." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Rebecca, as in Rebecca Winters? The woman you were with before Mom?" "Yes," David said, realizing he should have expected her reaction. Catherine had told Eliza about Rebecca years ago, when their precocious teenage daughter had found an old photograph and demanded to know who the pretty blonde woman with her father was. Catherine, always honest, had explained that David had loved someone deeply before her, and that sometimes life took unexpected turns. "Dad, wow. How was it, seeing her again after all these years?" David struggled to find the right words. "It was overwhelming, healing, confusing, beautiful." "All of that, huh?" Eliza sounded amused now. And we talked." really talked for the first time in 40 years. About what happened between us, about the lives we've lived since. And we're having dinner tomorrow night. Another silence, longer this time. Dad, is this something serious? David sighed, unsure how to explain feelings he was still trying to understand himself. I don't know yet, but it could be. I'd like it to be. But she lives in California, right? You mentioned that once. San Diego, David confirmed. But distance doesn't seem like such an insurmountable obstacle right now. He heard Eliza take a deep breath. Dad, I just want you to be happy. If reconnecting with Rebecca makes you happy, then I'm all for it. Just be careful, okay? Don't rush into anything. That's exactly what Rebecca said, David laughed. You two would probably get along well. Maybe I'll get to find out someday, Eliza replied, and David felt a rush of gratitude for his daughter's open-mindedness. Keep me posted, okay? I want to hear all about this dinner date. It's not a date, David protested weakly, then admitted, okay, maybe it is, and I will. After hanging up, David continued home, his mind full of the conversation with Rebecca, the possibilities that stretched before them. At 58, he had assumed his life was largely settled, that the major turning points were behind him. Now he found himself standing at another crossroads, faced with choices he had never expected to make. The house felt especially empty when he returned, Catherine's absence more pronounced than usual. He moved through the rooms restlessly, unable to settle, his thoughts a whirlwind of past and present, memory and possibility. Finally, he went to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the drawer he rarely accessed. Inside was a small wooden box, intricately carved, a gift from his grandfather when he graduated high school. With careful hands, he lifted it out and set it on the desk, then opened the lid to reveal the contents he had preserved for 4 decades. A faded blue ribbon from the senior prom corsage, a handwritten note on college stationery, meet me at the library, 7 p.m., bring coffee. Love, R. A small silver ring with a turquoise stone that Rebecca had worn on her right hand throughout college, which she had left behind in their apartment when she moved out. A Polaroid photograph of them at 19, standing on the beach during spring break, young and beautiful and unaware of the heartbreak that awaited them. David touched each item gently, memories flooding back. These mementos had survived 3 moves, a marriage, a lifetime of changes. He had never been able to discard them, even during his happiest years with Catherine. They represented not just Rebecca, but his own youth, his first experience of love in all its messy, transformative power. The telephone rang, startling him from his reverie. Setting aside the box, he answered to find Thomas on the line. Dave, just checking to make sure you got home all right last night. You left without saying goodbye. Sorry about that, David apologized. It was an emotional evening. I'll bet, Thomas replied knowingly. Listen, about Becky. Jenny and I were talking, and we think it's great that you two reconnected. Life's too short to hold on to old grudges. David smiled at his friend's characteristic directness. Thanks, Tommy. We're having dinner tomorrow night, actually. Well, well. Thomas sounded delighted. Look at you, moving fast. Good for you, man. And listen, if you need a character reference, I'm your guy. I'll tell her how you've matured into a somewhat decent human being. Gee, thanks, David laughed. Your support means the world. They chatted for a few more minutes before hanging up. And David realized with surprise how good it felt to reconnect with old friends, to rebuild bridges he had thought permanently burned. Perhaps that was what this weekend was really about. Not just a second chance with Rebecca, but a second chance at being part of a community he had deliberately distanced himself from. The rest of the day passed slowly. David tried to keep busy with household chores and work emails, but his mind kept drifting to Rebecca, to their conversation in the park, to the dinner that awaited them tomorrow evening. By the time he went to bed, he had mentally changed his outfit a dozen times and rehearsed opening lines he knew he would never actually use. Sunday dawned bright and clear, another perfect autumn day. David woke early, his sleep having been restless and filled with dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He went for a long run through the neighborhood, hoping physical exertion might calm his inexplicably jangled nerves. By the time he returned home, showered and had breakfast, it was still only 10 in the morning, with 9 hours stretching before him until he would see Rebecca again. He tried reading but couldn't focus. Tried watching a football game but couldn't maintain interest. Finally, he decided to drive to his mother's old house, which he had been meaning to check on anyway. The modest Cape Cod-style home was about 20 minutes outside of town, situated on 2 acres of land that had once been part of a larger farm. After his father died 15 years ago, his mother had stayed in the house until her own passing 5 years later. David had been unable to sell it, finding comfort in maintaining the connection to his childhood home. The house was well maintained, thanks to a local caretaker who checked on it weekly, mowing the lawn in summer and clearing snow in winter. David walked through the quiet rooms, running his hand along the familiar furniture draped in dust covers. His mother's presence seemed to linger here, in the floral wallpaper she had chosen, in the kitchen where she had taught him to make her famous apple pie, in the backyard where his father had built him a treehouse when he was 8. Standing in what had been his childhood bedroom, now converted to a guest room, David was struck by how deeply rooted he was in this place. Connecticut had always been home, even during the brief period after college when he had lived in New York City. The thought of leaving, of relocating to California or anywhere else, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Getting ahead of yourself, Mitchell," he muttered aloud. "It's one dinner date, not a marriage proposal," still as he locked up the house and drove back to town. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to start over somewhere new, to build a life that was entirely his own creation, not shaped by memories of Catherine or the familiar patterns of his existence in Millfield. By the time evening arrived, David had worked himself into a state of anticipation he hadn't experienced since his first date with Catherine almost 30 years earlier. He dressed carefully in dark jeans, a charcoal grey blazer, and the blue button-down that Eliza favored. As he knotted a casual tie, he laughed at himself in the mirror. 58 years old, and nervous as a teenager, he told his reflection. Get it together. The Millfield Inn was a historic building on the town green, a white-columned edifice that had stood since colonial times. David parked his car and approached the entrance, his heart beating a rapid tattoo against his ribs. The lobby was warmly lit, with polished wood floors and antique furniture that had been carefully preserved through the centuries. Rebecca was waiting for him, seated in one of the high-backed chairs near the fireplace. She wore a simple black dress, different from the one she had worn to the reunion, this one more casual but no less elegant. Her hair was down tonight, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. When she saw him, she stood, a smile lighting her features. "You look beautiful," David said honestly as he approached. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, her eyes taking in his appearance with obvious appreciation. There was a moment of awkwardness. Should they hug? Shake hands? But Rebecca solved it by stepping forward and placing a light kiss on his cheek.
"Shall we?"
David gestured toward the door, and they walked out together into the crisp evening air. The Twisted Vine was located in a converted barn at the edge of town, its rustic exterior belying the sophisticated dining experience within. David had made reservations, and they were seated at a corner table with views of both the open kitchen and the surrounding countryside visible through large windows. "This is lovely," Rebecca commented, looking around at the exposed beam ceiling and tasteful farm-themed decor. "Very different from what I remember of Millfield dining options. The culinary scene has definitely improved," David agreed. "No more having to drive to Hartford for a decent meal." They ordered wine, a local Connecticut vintage that surprised them both with its quality, and studied the menu, which featured seasonal ingredients sourced from farms within a 50-mile radius. The conversation flowed easily as they discussed food preferences, recent travels, and books they had enjoyed. "Do you remember how we used to dream about traveling the world?" Rebecca asked as their appetizers arrived. A charcuterie board for him, roasted beet salad for her. We had that list of places we wanted to visit together. David nodded, memories surfacing. Paris, Rome, Tokyo, Sydney. Did you ever make it to all of them? All except Sydney, Rebecca replied. Environmental law took me to a lot of interesting places, but Australia somehow always eluded me. You, Paris and Rome with Catherine and Eliza when she was 14. Tokyo for a project about 12 years ago. He smiled ruefully. Not quite the romantic backpacking adventure we had planned as college sophomores. Life rarely follows the plans we make when we're young, Rebecca observed. Sometimes that's disappointing, but sometimes it leads us places we never could have imagined. Like sitting here, having dinner together 40 years after we thought we'd never speak again. Rebecca raised her wineglass in a small toast. Exactly like that. The evening progressed with the same easy rhythm, their conversation deepening as they shared more about the lives they had lived apart from each other. David told stories about raising Eliza, about watching her grow from a precocious child into a compassionate young woman. Rebecca spoke of cases she had fought, the victories that had made the long hours and personal sacrifices worthwhile. By the time dessert arrived, a shared apple tart with local maple ice cream, they had covered careers, travel, politics, and health scares. They had compared notes on aging parents, on the challenge of maintaining friendships across decades, on the books and films that had shaped their worldviews. I keep waiting for this to feel strange, Rebecca admitted, gesturing between them with her dessert fork. Sitting here with you, talking as if no time has passed. But it doesn't feel strange at all. It feels right, David finished for her. It feels right. Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, David knew with certainty that whatever was happening between them was not merely nostalgia or curiosity about a road not taken. It was something new and vital, something that deserved exploration. Rebecca, he began, setting down his fork, I know you're leaving tomorrow. And I know we've agreed to take things slowly, see where this might lead. But I need you to know that I'm serious about this, about us, about the possibility of us. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. So am I, and that terrifies me if I'm being honest. We have complicated histories, David, lives built separately over 4 decades. It won't be easy to bridge that gap. The best things rarely are, he replied, squeezing her hand gently. But I think we've both learned that life is too short for regrets and what-ifs. I don't want to look back in another 40 years and wonder what might have happened if we had taken this chance. Rebecca nodded, her eyes suspiciously bright in the candlelight. Neither do I, so where do we go from here? Well, David said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, I happen to have some vacation time saved up. A lot of vacation time, actually. My assistant keeps threatening to schedule it for me if I don't use it soon. Is that so? Rebecca's lips curved in a small smile. And what might you do with all that vacation time? I was thinking San Diego might be nice this time of year. Warmer than Connecticut, certainly. Much warmer, Rebecca agreed, her smile widening. And I happen to have a guest room with a lovely view of the garden. Very comfortable. Sounds perfect, David said, meaning it. How does next month sound? I could come for a week, get to know your world a bit. Next month would be wonderful. Rebecca's expression grew more serious. But David, I want to be clear about something. If we're really going to explore this connection between us, I need us to be honest with each other. About everything. No holding back. No protecting each other from difficult truths. Absolute honesty, David promised. We're not kids anymore, Rebecca. We've both lived through enough to know that real relationships require real truth. She nodded, satisfied. Then yes, come to San Diego next month. I'll show you my garden, introduce you to my terrible painting skills, take you to my favorite spots along the coast. As they finished their dessert and David paid the bill, a comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the night had grown cooler, stars visible in the clear sky above. They walked slowly back to the inn, neither wanting the evening to end. At the entrance, they paused, standing close in the pool of light cast by the antique lamp above the door. Rebecca looked up at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen, even when they were young. "I'm glad we found each other again, David," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for this weekend." "So am I," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "More than I can express." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings and the weight of their shared history. Then, with a gentle deliberateness that spoke of conscious choice rather than impulsive desire, Rebecca leaned up and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but profound, a meeting of past and present, of who they had been and who they had become. When they parted, David felt a sense of homecoming he had not experienced in years. "Good night, David," Rebecca whispered, stepping back slightly. "I'll see you in the morning before I leave." "I'll be here at 9, he promised. "I'll bring coffee." She smiled at the reference to her old note, still preserved in his wooden box. "Wilson specials?" "Of course." With a final touch of her hand to his cheek, Rebecca turned and entered the inn, leaving David standing in the autumn night with the taste of her kiss still on his lips, and a future suddenly full of unexpected possibility. As he drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield, David felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow, Rebecca would return to California, and he to his life in Connecticut. But something fundamental had changed. A door had opened that had been closed for 40 years. Their story, it seemed, was not over after all. It was simply entering a new chapter, one they would write together, word by word, day by day, with the wisdom and patience that only time and experience could bring. And for the first time since Catherine's death, David found himself looking forward not just to tomorrow, but to all the tomorrows that might follow, uncertain, uncharted, but full of possibility. The unexpected reunion at the dance had indeed changed everything, not by erasing the past, but by transforming it into a foundation for something new and deeply meaningful. As he parked in his driveway and looked up at the house that had been his and Catherine's, David whispered a silent thank you to Catherine for the love they had shared, to Rebecca for the courage to begin again, and to whatever twist of fate had brought them back into each other's lives when they needed it most. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. For tonight, it was enough to know that sometimes life offered second chances in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes the bravest thing one could do was to accept them. "Did I act right? Or if you were in my place, what would you have done?"